Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Teacher Education for Computational Thinking, a digital promise webinar sponsored by the Robin Hood Learning and Technology Fund. I'm Kelly Mills, Project Director of Computational Thinking at Digital Promise. And before we get started today, just take a few minutes to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name and role, organization and state, and something you're hoping to learn about today. All right, it looks like we have a, I was at College Park, yay. Well, okay. Well, thanks so much. Continue to introduce yourself in the chat. I'm going to get started introducing the agenda. Thank you so much for joining us. So for today's agenda, we're excited to share a brief overview of our recently released report, Computational Thinking for an Inclusive World, which inspired the need for today's webinar. A majority of our time together will be hearing from our expert panel about their experiences integrating computational thinking into teacher education. Finally, we'll have some time in the end for Q&A. Throughout the webinar, please contribute any comments or questions in the chat. We are excited to facilitate an active and engaging discussion on and off screen. So with support from the Robin Hood Learning and Technology Fund, we recently developed the report, Computational Thinking for an Inclusive World, a resource for educators to learn and lead. This report is an update of our 2017 report, Computational Thinking for a Computational World. The updated report provides practical guidance for educators to integrate computational thinking into disciplinary learning across pre-K through 12 education, while centering inclusivity, using framework strategies and specific examples through case studies of educators learning and leading with computational thinking. In the report, we call all educators to integrate computational thinking into disciplinary learning across K through 12 education, while centering inclusivity, to equip students with the skills they need to participate in our increasingly technological world and promote justice for students and society at large. This report issues 2 calls to action for educators to design inclusive computing learning opportunities for students. The first is integrating computational thinking into disciplinary learning. However, integrating computational thinking into every classroom is not something that can be left to individual educators. Educational leaders must prioritize the initiative and build capacity for educators to do so. The second call to action is to build teachers' capacity for computational thinking. In developing the report, we connected with a number of educational leaders that shared their insights. A need that emerged from these conversations is to integrate computational thinking into teacher education, to develop a pipeline of teachers that enter the classroom equipped with computational thinking skills, which is the impetus for today's webinar and panel discussion. Now I am thrilled to pass it off to my colleague, Lotero Cabrera, and our panelists, each of who have expertise integrating computational thinking into pre-service teacher education.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. I'm Elsie. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maryland, and I am currently working on a project where we are just starting, but the goal is to deliver professional development to support teachers in integrating computational thinking into their science instruction, while also implementing culturally responsive teaching practices. So I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to introduce yourselves. So why don't we start with Aman?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm a professor in the College of Education at Michigan State University. Broadly, my work is focused on supporting pre-service and in-service teachers to bring computational thinking into their instruction, primarily to support disciplinary learning. I've been involved in computational thinking since 2009 when I was a faculty member at Purdue, and then continued to build on that work.
Diane?
Hi all, I'm Diane Joss-Kettlehead. I'm a professor of science education and learning technologies in the College of Ed at the University of Maryland. I started researching and designing teacher education on integrating computational thinking into elementary science education about 6 years ago. My current research, as Elsie just mentioned, because we work together, is on helping teachers design science lessons that integrate computational thinking and are taught with culturally responsive pedagogical strategies. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Christella?
Welcome, everyone. So nice to be here with you today. I'm Cristela Musa. I'm the director and professor in the School of Education at the University of Delaware. And just like Aman and Diane, my work has been focusing primarily on the development of computational thinking skills among both pre-service and in-service teachers. So I would say I've been in this space for about 10 years or so now. At the undergraduate level, we work primarily with teachers in the elementary and early middle school grades, and our professional development efforts focus across the board. More recently, also doing some research practice practitioner work, also trying to integrate some cultural responsive pedagogies into our work, which we have done for the last several years, and trying to make the activities more relevant to kids in different backgrounds, in different environments.
Thank you. Ankit?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ankit Patel. I'm the Director of STEM Education Programs at the City University of New York, CUNY. I sit centrally in the Office of the University Dean for Education. And for the past 7 years, I've worked specifically on teacher training in computer science, initially as part of the Computer Science for All initiative at the New York City Department of Education, training in-service teachers, K through 12, and now at CUNY, thinking about how this work can be woven into teacher preparation programs to create a more sustainable pipeline. And yeah, happy to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but not least, Carlos.
Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here. I'm the Director of Educational Technology and the Center for Teaching and Learning at Hostos Community College, which is also part of the CUNY system. I've been doing educational technology for about 20 years, training faculty in how to use technology and educational technologies. And recently, we've been working with a colleague from the education department to implement computational thinking, educational technology to teacher education programs. And now more than ever is relevant to be talking about computational thinking and enhancing digital literacy skills for our students. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your introductions. And I would like to start by getting to know a little bit more about the work that you do and the contributions you made to this report. So let me start with Ankit. You've worked to integrate computational thinking into your pre-service coursework, right? And so could you tell us a little bit more about the support systems that you provided for pre-service teachers to expand their knowledge and understanding in practicing computational thinking?
Yeah, so 2 years ago, with the support of the Robin Hood Learning and Tech Fund, we piloted the integration of CT at 2 of CUNY's teacher ed programs. Started with 1 and then expanded to 2, and now we're looking to expand to all 15 colleges that have teacher ed programs. We've worked with Carlos, and I'm excited for you all to hear from him. But from my perspective, sitting in the University Dean for Education's office centrally, working with all of these programs, we're looking, at who our students are, trying to identify initially, like, what are the right programs to be targeting. So knowing that, that CUNY freshmen, 80% of them are coming from, NYC public schools. We know our teachers are representative of the city, and we wanted to target the largest programs so that we could, evaluate how exactly, like, learn what CT integration looked like for the programs that are pumping out the most teachers. So those are childhood education, special education programs. We decided to focus our efforts there instead of, say, like secondary math or science, where the integration may have been conceptually more facile, because again, like, the impact and the number of teachers that we could reach. So to support those students, we first needed to focus on supporting the faculty, and we had to choose multiple faculty, and we included clinical because we knew that CT integration is very much based on practice. There's no cookie cutter sort of way to go about it, and so we wanted students to have pre-service teachers to have experience doing this in classrooms with the support of a faculty member. And then second, with those faculty, we needed, because they're in these generalist programs, we needed to give them time to develop their computing pedagogical content knowledge. And then finally, to actually help them integrate this into their coursework, we did a sort of academic year co-design. So we kind of set them up in the summer with some of this pedagogical content knowledge, and then worked with them throughout the academic year. And we tried to bring in student feedback through focus groups, or look at student work, look at their lessons that they were creating as they were integrating into the clinical practice. And so, staying connected with the student experience was very important. And we set some clear expectations for students on what they're required to do in their clinical practice. But then we also realized, okay, great, a huge part of the student experience is what's going on at their placement school. So we try to intentionally partner with schools there's lots and lots of districts in New York City. We partnered with one district and we had them identify specific schools that could be supportive of this project. And then we realized in the second year that we needed schools that had cooperating teachers that were versed in computational thinking so they could be supportive of the specific practice in the classroom. But to help with that, where teachers didn't have that content knowledge, we trained cooperating teachers as well, and we helped them understand what are the project goals, and tried to tie it back to the larger Computer Science for All initiative in the city so that they understood how all of this was working together. So really there was 6 things here. So choosing multiple faculty, include clinical faculty. There was building faculty pedagogical content knowledge, co-designing with them, using student work and feedback, partnering with schools intentionally for the clinical placements, training cooperating teachers, and setting really clear expectations for students and collecting data from them. All of those were necessary. A lot of that was student driven, telling us that you all need to do these things. So we learned a lot between years 1 and years 2. And I think understanding that all 6 of these things are important to driving these types of integration sustainably and forward and at scale would be probably the #1 learning.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that, thank you for summarizing those in those 6 points. I think that's really helpful. And I think that there are some themes that you mentioned that I suspect will also emerge. Things like sustainability, like thinking of how to reach the most students. I think those are key things that will come up. So let's continue with Diane. So obviously, I know your work very well. And one of the complexities of teacher education is something that Ankit was just mentioning, of the interaction between pre-service and in-service teachers, and how the pre-service teachers have to work within their placements, right? And their experiences in the classroom. Could you tell us a little bit about your approach to develop a professional learning community for computational thinking integration?
Absolutely. Thanks, Elsie. So about 6-7 years ago, I and my colleagues, Randy McGinnis and Jan Plain, Randy was in the College of Ed with me and Jan is in computer science. We began redesigning our elementary science methods course for undergraduates to include both a module on computational thinking and integration into their projects, lesson plans, et cetera. And it went well until we started to get feedback from the students. And the students were saying that they were reluctant to actually include computational thinking in their lessons. So while they would design it for us that way, but when they actually went to implement, they didn't always include it. And one of the reasons was because their mentor teachers had no idea what computational thinking was. And so they either couldn't support the students, and these are beginning teacher, pre-service teachers. So they're in their first semester of doing this work. So not having the support was really something that was problematic for them. Or the mentor teachers were actually opposed to doing it. And really, when you think about it, pre-service teachers don't have power, they don't have clout or standing in the classroom to buck the mentor teacher's position. I spent a lot of years as a K-12 science teacher, and there's a lot of pressure put on pre-service teachers to do the kind of practice that their mentor teachers are doing. So we realized that this approach of just changing the science methods course wasn't going to really work if we wanted to change practice in the schools. So we created when we really got the project up and running, we created a professional learning community that we call the STIG-CT, which stands for, and I'll hopefully get this correct, Science Teachers Inquiry Group on Computational Thinking. And in that group, what we did was we brought together the pre-service teachers that had already learned about it in their methods course, and their mentor teachers, for whom we gave a sort of intensive workshop to get them caught up to where their pre-service teachers were already. And the purpose of this professional learning group was to co-design science lessons that integrated computational thinking. And what we hoped to do by doing that was to allow a space in the schools for the pre-service teachers to practice and for the mentor teachers to also learn, so that when their pre-service teacher graduated, they would then continue that work as well going forward. We learned a lot that first year. We had some successes, and we learned where we needed to do some more supporting. So in the second year, that we did this work, our community was much larger. We found that our pre-service teachers were, many of them were very intrigued by the process, and they came back as first-year teachers. Our mentor teachers came back with mentees, new mentees, and some of our mentor teachers who had no mentees also came back because they still wanted to engage in this process. And so our final design for this professional learning community, which had quite a bit of success from what we can see, but has still some improvements that are needed, had 3 parts to the professional learning community. The first part was learning about what it looks like to do computational thinking in science. So that's more of a kind of, experiencing learning, seeing what's happening, and then to actually do the experiencing as a learner. So take the teachers and give them a chance to be a learner in a classroom that is doing that work and see what it's like to teach science with computational thinking while someone else is modeling that process and they're learning about it as a student. And then the last piece that we had the teachers working on it in our community was co-designing with us. And we framed it very carefully as that because we see the mentor teachers as experts in the classroom. We see the pre-service teachers as experts in new pedagogies, new theory, and many of them had expertise in technology that their mentor teachers didn't have. And then we as a design team brought together all of our expertise, and we came from different backgrounds: computer science, science education, computer science education. There was a sort of a broad array. And we said, look, we all have different experiences, but to create a really good science lesson that integrates computational thinking into it, we really need to bring in all of our expertise together. And so we created communities of practice, little small groups of community practice around grade levels. And it had that group working together to create these lessons. And that worked really well. And we have now moved on and realized there was one piece missing. And so we are now continuing to add to that and redesign it by including culturally responsive pedagogies to that. But in general, that's the work that we've been doing so far.
Absolutely, yeah, and I can tell you from experience that those co-design sessions of teachers, pre-service teachers, in-service teachers, and researchers in the same room were fascinating and really productive. I'd like to move on to Carlos, and I know that you've developed a course, right, that integrates computational thinking into introductory education coursework in community college. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about that context. And can you tell us about students' experiences in this course and the role of computational thinking in teacher preparation in community college?
Sure. I was happy to work with Ankit and other members of mine in exploring how we will bring computational thinking to curriculum and identifying how this will be not just an add-on, but just making sure that it's part of the design of how we teach. We had that opportunity to develop an introduction to instructional technology course from the ground up, which gave us a lot of opportunities for rethinking on how we're going to be focusing on designing this course, focusing on project-based learning, flipped learning, making sure that students are able to identify and connect that CT would provide them that whole idea of becoming problem solvers, especially now how we are in this environment where teachers are exposed to be making decisions and bringing new technologies at a second because of the changes that we're going through, and the amount of professional development that they will potentially receive or support they will receive will be limiting. So how they could use these skills in the class, computational thinking skills, to be able to be ready and be able to, then when they go to a classroom, when they're going to start teaching, they're going to be able to understand how they could address any of these practices. So this course was designed in a way to focus on computational thinking skills, connected with digital literacy, digital fluency, digital citizenship. And at the same time, we were able to include UDL, inclusivity. So students were exposed to, this is how you're going to be seeing this in your classrooms. How are you going to be reacting? Develop lessons that we're going to be, you're going to be applying and using right away with your students. And even the concepts of translanguaging and coding, you're going to be exposed. You're going to have students that are going to be having these needs. How are you going to be modifying the way that you're teaching, thinking on using computational thinking as a strategy for you to address those needs for your students. And just, the whole idea was the students were able to be looking at the class that is modeling what they're going to be learning, and then they apply right away. And the elements that they were designing were elements that they could use right away for practice. There were many of them that were paraprofessionals, or they were assistant, they were doing practices in some schools, so then they were immediately knowing and making the connection to what they were learning in the class. So far we've gotten very, very good feedback from our students. We'll continue to make changes. Like Diane said, is a process that will continue to evolve, and then learning from our students as well.
Yeah, wonderful. That sounds like a really interesting approach, also of thinking very much in practical terms. And it sounds like you have some really transformational concepts to integrate in there, like UDL and CT and all at the same time. So super interesting. Okay, so I want to know also a little bit more about Cristela's work. And I know that we discussed a little bit about a challenge of integrating computational thinking into teacher education is that, as I think pretty much everyone here has mentioned, you're preparing teachers to work in a classroom, right? That already has a set of priorities and initiatives. And so I was wondering if you could describe a little bit of your approach to develop a shared vision for computational thinking across teacher education programs and partner districts.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yes, you're absolutely right. Managing district priorities is obviously very important. And we have seen particularly this challenge very clearly through the pandemic, while obviously the primary focus tended to be a lot more in disciplinary content. But at the same time, I feel like the pandemic has also highlighted the critical role of computational thinking. If we think, for example, this idea of understanding data, which is a key component of computational thinking, and how data can be used to look at the impact of the pandemic on one's community, right? So I think those opportunities have really helped highlight the critical role of computational thinking in our daily lives. And as we move along, I think we can certainly leverage them in our efforts to build more of a shared vision. So my team and I have been involved with working with districts, obviously, as I mentioned, for almost a decade now. And we're now in the midst of a research practice partnership. So as we speak, working with teachers in grades 3 to 5 from a variety of districts and schools, so in our state. So we have developed a set of practices we use to kind of cultivate that shared vision and understanding. So I think the first part is that we work very closely with our practitioner partners. In this case, our partners are both our colleagues in the Department of Education and subsequently the district leadership, so that we can explain the purpose of our work. So they need to be aware, obviously, so that they can both recommend teachers who might be good candidates, for becoming sort of like key players back in their schools, but also in terms of being aware of the work so that they can be more supportive. We work very closely with teachers themselves, as you might imagine, and I think that's very similar to what everyone else has been sharing. Really just here leveraging the important role of our teacher partners. So we work with teachers to design lessons that are directly aligned with the curricula that they're responsible back in their districts. So I think we have heard, but also read in the report, the important role of this tight integration of computational thinking with disciplinary content. That's what Diane has been discussing as well. So I think just highlighting that relevance of computational thinking in relation to content is very critical. We know that teachers are very tight in terms of time, and they're already working under very tight time constraints. So they have to see how this is part or a component of what they're responsible and not something that is an add-on. So in our professional development efforts, we really ask teachers to bring their curricula with them to the professional development setting, and then we examine the relationship between what they're responsible, and the computational thinking concepts and practices that might be best aligned or leveraged, to help them with their content. We also do that for the lesson planning template. So we don't impose one, but if there's a lesson planning template that a district or a teacher is already responsible for using, we just work with them. So again, trying to kind of remove those barriers that might create additional time constraints for our teachers. The second component is that we really do position teachers to assume a critical role in this partnership. So we solicit their continuous feedback on their needs, both in terms of content, technology skills that they might need to acquire, and the technologies and whatever they might have available back in their districts, right? We can't focus on tools that they don't have access to. And then we work with them to support data collection and demonstrate the impact of these activities on student outcomes, both in terms of the computational thinking skills and concepts, but also their persistence towards computing. And as a last step, this work is always connected to, as I mentioned, standards. So in our state, we have adopted computer science standards across the board, K through 12. So this ensures, again, that they're working towards expectations, something that they're expected to do. One thing we do try to do is actually invite teams of teachers from the same school in grades 3 to 5. And what this helps is actually kind of build that vertical alignment, so they can see how students can, what kind of skills they can continue to build, as they progress. And finally, just ensuring communication in all directions. I feel it's very important with teachers and with our partners at the Department of Education. And this ensures that our work is not only connected to the individual teacher needs, but the district priorities, the curricula they're responsible, and then Department of Education really priorities, therefore creating more of a supportive ecosystem.
Wonderful. That sounds really interesting. It's almost like instead of connecting what happens in the classroom, in the pre-service classroom, and what they do in their classroom, you're sort of centering what the work in the schools and really trying to support that work as opposed to sort of make lines later, if you wish. That's really interesting. I really like those approaches and specific strategies on how to do that. Really interesting. I have another question for one more of our panelists. Aman, we know that you worked with for about 10 years or more in pre-service computational thinking education. What are your recommendations from being in this work for such a period of time for teacher educators who are looking to integrate computational thinking into their programs? What do you think are some of the most critical elements?
Thanks, Elsie. First of all, it's great to see that after 10 years, we're having these broader conversations on how do we bring CT into teacher education, right? And so that's the trajectory of the work, right? That it takes about 10 years to make this mainstream, so to speak. I think we need to rethink, in order to really bring CT within teacher education programs, we need to rethink what the goals of computational thinking are, right? Oftentimes, we put too much emphasis on using CT as a way to teach computer science, right? Which is not an appealing argument for teacher education faculty, because we still need to prepare teachers to teach literacy, social studies, science, math, right? And now we're saying, let's add computer science too in that mix, right? Teacher education programs like K-12 schools, the curriculum is a zero-sum game. If we add something, something else gotta come out, right? So rather than framing CT integration from a computer science perspective, that it's important for all students to learn computing, I think we need to approach CT from how does it help support disciplinary learning, right? How can CT help pre-service teachers be better prepared to teach literacy, social studies, math, science, right? And then learning about computing or with computing is an added benefit. I think that's the approach we need to take, because oftentimes when I collaborate with teacher education faculty, you hear that, but my pre-service teachers need to learn how to teach science, right? They need to learn how to teach math, right? And so I think the argument that we're using CT to support what they're already doing in the classroom is a more appealing argument for the teacher education faculty, right? So making those connections between CT and specific subjects more explicit, right? And then collaborating with the teacher education faculty as CS education researchers, because then we all bring different expertise that's necessary for CT integration, right? And then through some of the work that we have done with Ankit and Carlos and Jaren Ochak, who's a postdoc here at MSU, is to make those connections and supporting faculty making those connections, right? So as a result, so we did PD with about 49 faculty from the CUNY system this past summer, right? So that's a large group of faculty who are learning about computational thinking, right? And as a result of that work, faculty saw CT as a transdisciplinary skill, as a metacognitive way of thinking about teaching the particular discipline that they're focusing on. They talked about CT as a neo-literacy and a competency, but then also it's helping pre-service teachers better understand and teach the content, right, that they're teaching, right? So I think, again, like it goes back to that point of making those connections between CT and the disciplines more explicit, and then collaborating with teacher education faculty to bring CT into the classroom and not approaching it from a computer science perspective. So.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that where you started was sort of thinking about the goals of CT integration is a process that everyone who has a CT project should do and within your own teams, and we should also have that broader discussion. But really interesting strategies on how to sort of make a more widespread approach, especially when thinking of universities and faculty, and how to connect it to the work that they're doing and the goals that they already have, right, of helping teachers teach their disciplinary or their discipline specifically. Yeah. Okay, so I want to move on in the interest of time to maybe get to ask one of these more general questions to the panel, and the first one is bringing back the one of the main things about the report is about centering inclusivity and making sure that this work is being inclusive. And so how can we support teachers to provide computational thinking opportunities for all students, and particularly to those that experience marginalization? And I'd like to start maybe with Carlos.
Thank you. I think the way, as Aman was mentioning, we have to rethink on how we're bringing computational thinking to the curriculum and making sure that we are able to make it an approach, a framework that you use for the content that you're teaching and how you're teaching it, and just making sure that, for my class, we have a module for UDL, but then that also should be kind of a component that is understood, where you should consider having the way that you teach, having UDL concepts in mind, like CT concepts in mind. So how do you use all of these strategies that computational thinking provide you to then approach different issues that you have in whichever discipline? We had an opportunity to train faculty from math, from business, and from education to follow up the trainings that were provided in the summer. And then they were able to see this as okay, this is a way for me to rethink on how I'm teaching. The things that I have been doing, let me bring these concepts and then be able to adjust the approaches that I've been doing. So I'm not changing what I'm teaching, but I'm changing my approaches and infusing at the same time computational thinking. Start talking about with the students that computational thinking is not computer science like it's usually seen, but it's just an approach, strategies that help students become better problem solvers. So I think it's in that sense that we start infusing throughout different curriculums computational thinking, so that this becomes just ubiquitous and not an add-on for the curriculums that we are going to be developing and teaching.
Yeah, so taking like a very wide approach and trying to spread it. Yeah, very interesting. Ankit?
Yeah, I'd build on that, is that going broad and then also repeating. Maybe that's spiraling, or that's just more opportunities. Often with students that are marginalized, they have to leave classrooms for different services, and that's maybe when time students are going to have their CS or CT activity, or they And this idea of infusing certainly like provides an opportunity for these experiences to happen during class time when all students are present. But then to do it multiple times throughout the year, that's important. And we've seen how important that is for training the pre-service teachers. I think that they, if we train them that way, they're more likely to sort of bring that type of practice into their classroom. The other thing I will say, and I don't know if I like really drew the line when I was talking about like how we were thinking about which students to like roll this project out with at CUNY, is that we have students with, sort of less than ideal STEM experiences coming to CUNY. They're choosing to teacher education because they want to maybe avoid math and science and computing. And they're going to be childhood teachers. They don't have to worry about those types of things. And so, as we move forward, infusing CT into our pre-service coursework is an opportunity to, with faculty, unpack, like, how do we unpack these issues that pre-service teachers are bringing? How do we, incorporate their experience and think about how they can build on that and reach their students that are likely feeling similarly about math and science, so that we sort of break the cycle of, our teachers, being math and science and computing phobic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really interesting point of also thinking of teachers' experiences and how those relate to student experiences, like the classroom student experiences and STEM education too. I think we may have time to for one more person to answer that. Would anyone like to volunteer to answer this question on inclusivity and making sure that we do this work inclusively?
Yeah, I think like the one way that we have thought about in our work is how can CT tools and practices be used in a way to center students in the curriculum itself, right? So for example, how can Scratch be used as a tool for students to tell their stories and represent their lived experiences in the classroom, right? And bring that and connect their lives and their classrooms more integrally.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Well, I think it is time to move on to some of the audience questions. We've had, Marika and Kelly, I think, have been monitoring and reading your questions. So I'll start with a question addressed to Diane. The question is, Diane, you mentioned incorporating culturally relevant pedagogies into your PLCs. I'm curious to hear how you introduce CRP and provided guidance for your teachers.
Let me start with the history, because I can do that better than I can actually answer the full question, and I'll get to the reasons for that in a second. So when we first started this work, we entered it with this idea that if you do computational thinking at the elementary school level, then you have an opportunity to have all students have access to these experiences. Waiting to middle school or high school, where it becomes an after-school program or an elective, if you don't know what this is about, you're not going to choose those things. There's too many other competing interests, or after school is problematic, particularly for students who are in a family where they need to go home and provide child support for younger siblings, et cetera. And so we walked into this work, and we worked with the professional learning community teachers and told them, this is our perspective. And we sort of had this shared understanding that this was the reason we did this. And then we went on and talked, as I mentioned earlier, talked about how you do science education and computational thinking integrated together. Never giving them any absolute frameworks or ways to think about it, but just trusting them and the fact that we all agreed that this was the motivation for this work. And what we found, and it's thanks to Marika, who's with us today, and some of the analysis work she did, is that a fair number of our teachers said, yes, we agree with all of that, but because of things like classroom management issues or obstacles in their school-based communities, they found it was not feasible from their perspective to do this with whole classes. And so they started to do outside the traditional classroom experiences. So we're back to issues with people having to volunteer, or they would focus in on small groups of students who already were the ones who probably already had these experiences outside school already, students who finished early. So we realized, as we looked at this analysis, as we thought about the work, that our just saying this and having everybody agree to it isn't enough, that there needs to be absolutely supports for, frameworks for, practice in creating these lesson plans that prioritize, as Aman said, the students are in the center of it, right? Looking at funds of knowledge, creating a science, we do this, you know, when I was a science teacher, we try to do this a lot as well, bringing in things from the students' lives to make science authentic and real to them. And this is the kind of work that we want to be doing now. And the reason I've spent time in the history and where we're at is that this project that we're just starting is literally just starting. And the question is a question that Elsie and I are gonna leave this webinar and go into 2 hours worth of meetings that are gonna be largely focused on how do we do this in workshops with teachers? How do we actually give them this, you know, the skills and the frameworks and the understandings of who their students are, and therefore how to make these lessons really personalized to the culture, the context, and the interest of the students who are going to be receiving, if you will, those lessons. So sort of a sideways answer, but I hope that's as best as I can do right now. Come back in a year and we'll talk more.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that history of why the motivation behind is really important. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And continuing with this theme, the theme of inclusivity, the second question we have here from the audience is, does anyone have successful examples of how CT is integrated or used to support students in ELL or special education classes that experience a lot of pullout from the classroom? What do pre-service students in these areas need to know to be successful advocating for these students to have access?
Yeah, we have a, I can take a stab at this question. We have a small NSF project where we have integrated computational thinking into our math methods course for special education teachers, right? Again, the argument for integration is, or for CT integration is, so all students have access to computing and computational thinking, right? So as a result of bringing into methods courses, right, we're trying to remove that barrier so the kids are there in that classroom, right? They're not being pulled out when CT lessons or computer science lessons are happening, right? But by integrating that within the context of math, all students are present in the classroom, and the special education pre-service teachers are prepared to support students with disabilities. So I think that's the approach we have taken on CT integration, rather than just saying like computing as a standalone thing.
Any other answers or contributions to that?
I dropped a link to PLSCS in the chat. It's a project that's specifically targeting emerging bilingual literacy education.
This is not a direct answer, but I thought the report had some really nice examples related to that. So maybe we can point them out to the panelists. I also see that Diane is here, and my team, along with her team at the Maryland Center for Computing Education, we have actually been working with faculty across disciplines, including faculty in special ed, helping them design such activities that they can incorporate into their methods courses so that students across disciplines. So that ties very well with what Aman was talking, as well as the work that the other panelists have described in terms of integration across teacher ed context. And one of the things that we have found is just sometimes it's really just pointing out the connections. Like there are practices that are already happening and in those courses that really could be leveraged in special ed. Like in special ed, we talk a lot about differentiation, right? So just pointing out those connections and how different activities could be differentiated. So even if they're in a pull-out session, you know, they could still build on the core of what's happening in the classroom and have something that could tie in well with what they're doing in a pull-out session.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, Carlos?
Just one addition to the fact that you are bringing a conversation with the students about accessibility needs, about UDL, how you have to design your lessons with everybody in mind, that the lessons that you're designing shouldn't be specific provide or ask for specific requirements, but then you have to make sure that you provide opportunities for different needs. You start having those conversations with your students, and you'd be surprised. It's like, well, yeah, I never thought about that I would have a challenge. And then the immediate question is, so how will you change your lesson? How would you be able to provide so that there is no dependency on anything in order for you to be able to engage everybody? And then having this conversation about ableism, invisible accessibility. So all of those conversations are the starting point to make sure that they will bring more of that accessibility. And then, of course, the implementation for special needs and ELL will be a lot more, but then the beginning of acknowledging and how we should start developing and thinking how we design lessons is important.
Yeah, excellent points. Really interesting to also think about how do we get teachers to have this mindset, not just when focusing on one group, but really of all their students and thinking of their particular classrooms. Okay, I think we have about 3 minutes before we have to do the wrap up. So maybe we can, somebody can quickly answer this question, which is, what has your research found related to implementation of CT and local school culture or context? Did you find any needs related to leadership change management, or anything else at the systems level? Was thinking a little bit about the work of CT in the classroom and how that relates to the broader school context.
I think that's a great question. And I think that kind of fits back to this idea of how do you communicate and make this work align with the district priorities, right? And those priorities are set by the leadership. I know some of the strategies that we have tried in the past was to invite either principals or actually guiding counselors as well in the professional development, because it's important for them to understand, if we're talking about CS in an inclusive way, then how to make sure, that those guiding counselors are aware and they're not just pointing those kids who are naturally skilled in technology and computer science towards those fields, right? So that's important. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in our work, we first meet with either the principal or curriculum coordinator, because it's important for them to understand. And a lot of times we get, those suggestions that, work with the kids that are in the enrichment program, or work with the teachers, who are responsible for this extra or this enrichment. And I think just educating that, this work is essential for all and not the kids who, they would find their way either way. So setting those initial meetings, I feel, and setting the expectations and educating both the leadership of the school or district, and then working closely, as I mentioned earlier, with State Department partners, because a lot of that work is also articulated in their own priorities.
I personally haven't, it's been hard to do systems level research, right? Because oftentimes schools are driven by content learning goals and not by CT learning goals, right? So on an individual or a departmental or a grade level, we've done some work, but I'd recommend to put a shameless plug, this book on computational thinking has a chapter from my dear colleague, Rafi Santo, who focuses on a district strategy and how computational thinking played out in a particular district, including a pushback from teachers and faculty that we're already doing that and we don't need computational thinking in the school, right? So I think that'd be a good chapter for to look at if you're interested in systems level work.
Wonderful. So thank you all for answering my questions, also the audience questions. I really appreciated your discussion. I'm going to throw it back to Kelly, who's going to do some wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Waltero, for moderating an amazing conversation, each of our panelists for answering all of the questions and sharing your expertise and experience with us. And of course, the participants for staying engaged and really driving a really, really interesting conversation. This is such important and interesting work, and each person has such interesting insights. So I really, really loved this panel. Thank you so much to the Robin Hood Learning and Technology Fund for giving us the opportunity to share this space. And I know that even though this webinar is ending, this work will continue and these conversations will continue. So feel free to stay connected in this really great learning community.